Ethan Ward had built his reputation on discipline, focus, and control. Every detail of his life was carefully managed, from the boardroom where he led one of the fastest-growing tech companies in the country, to the polished glass penthouse where he lived high above the city. For him, rules were not suggestions, they were laws. His machines, his data, and his workspace were sacred. Nobody was allowed to touch them. Not his friends, not his business partners, and certainly not the people who worked in his home. On a cold Tuesday evening, after an exhausting day filled with meetings and negotiations, Ethan decided to head home earlier than usual. His team expected him to work late, but something inside him longed for the quiet of his apartment. He wanted to be alone, to enjoy a few moments of peace before preparing for the next day's storm. He stepped out of the sleek black car that had driven him from the office, his sharp suit still neat despite the long hours, and walked into the silent lobby of his building. The elevator ride to the top floor was smooth and quick, the kind of luxury only a man of his wealth could afford. As the doors opened, he stepped into the grand living space he had carefully designed. The air smelled faintly of lavender, the scent his maid always used after cleaning. Everything appeared to be in perfect order. The marble counters shone, the wooden floors were spotless, and not a single item seemed out of place. At first, Ethan felt relief. But as he set down his briefcase and loosened his tie, he noticed a faint glow coming from the far end of the hallway. It was coming from the room he guarded most closely, his private study. Ethan frowned. He never left his computer on. His machines were programmed to shut down automatically when not in use. His steps grew heavier as he moved toward the door. A strange feeling spread across his chest, part suspicion, part irritation. He pushed the door open quietly, and the sight that met his eyes stopped him cold. There, sitting at his desk, was Clara. Clara had been working in his apartment for 3 months now. She was young, barely in her 20s, with a quiet manner and a habit of keeping her eyes down. She did her job well, cleaning every corner of his home with careful precision. Ethan had never given her much thought beyond her duties. She was just another employee in his well-ordered life. But now she was sitting in his chair, facing his computer, her fingers flying across the keyboard as if she owned it. Her face was lit by the blue glow of the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. She didn't even notice him at first. Ethan's jaw tightened. Anger surged through him. Nobody, absolutely nobody, was allowed to touch his computer. That machine contained sensitive projects, private codes, and confidential information that could not be exposed. The sight of her there felt like a betrayal. "Clara," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the quiet room. She jumped in surprise, her hands freezing on the keyboard. The chair squeaked as she turned to face him, her eyes wide with fear. For a moment, she looked like a child caught stealing cookies from a jar. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Ethan stepped further into the room, his tall frame filling the doorway. "What are you doing here?" His tone was low, controlled, but every word carried the weight of his authority. I'm sorry, sir," Clara stammered, rising quickly from the chair. Her hands trembled as she stepped back, almost tripping over herself. "I didn't mean. I was only you were only what?" Ethan snapped. His eyes darted to the computer screen, expecting to see some mess, maybe a broken system or a ruined file. He had no patience for excuses. She had crossed a line, and in his world, that meant consequences. Clara lowered her head, her face burning with shame. "Please, I wasn't trying to cause harm. I should not have touched it. I know it was wrong. I'm so sorry." Ethan moved closer, ready to shut down the machine and deal with her afterward. But then his eyes caught something unusual. The screen wasn't filled with random browsing or open documents. It was covered in lines of code, complex, structured, and strangely elegant. For a moment, Ethan stopped breathing. His anger was still there, but it was pushed aside by confusion. He leaned closer, scanning the screen. This wasn't the work of an amateur. Whoever had written this code had a sharp mind, one that understood logic and creativity in equal measure. Clara, still trembling, noticed the change in his expression. "Please, sir. I can explain." But Ethan wasn't listening to her now. His thoughts were racing. This code didn't belong to his company, and it wasn't something he had written. That meant Clara had been writing it herself. His maid, quiet, shy, almost invisible, had been creating something extraordinary on his computer. He turned to her slowly, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and curiosity. "Where did you learn this?" he asked, his voice no longer as harsh, but firm enough to demand an answer. Clara clasped her hands together, nervously twisting her fingers. I used to study computer science," she whispered. "Before I had to leave school. I couldn't afford it anymore. But I still practice, when I can. I didn't think you would come home early today." Ethan stared at her, stunned. The story didn't match the picture he had built of her in his mind. To him, she had been just another worker, someone who kept the floors shining and the shelves dust-free. But here she was, standing in his study, revealing a hidden world of talent he hadn't suspected. The silence in the room grew heavy. Clara's chest rose and fell quickly, as if she were preparing to be dismissed, or worse. She expected him to shout, to fire her immediately, to call security and have her escorted out. Ethan's heart, however, was caught between two emotions. His instinct told him to be furious she had broken his trust, touched his private computer without permission. Yet another part of him, a quieter but stronger part, couldn't ignore what he had seen on that screen. Finally, he spoke again, his tone quieter than before. "Do you realize what could have happened if you had damaged my system?" "Yes, sir," Clara said quickly, her eyes filling with tears. "I know. I was wrong. Please forgive me. I'll leave right now if you want. I'll never come back." Her words carried so much fear that Ethan almost felt a sting of guilt. He hadn't expected her to break so easily. And yet, he couldn't let her go, not just yet. Not until he understood what exactly he had stumbled upon. Instead of answering, Ethan turned back to the computer and studied the code again. His mind was sharp, trained to recognize potential. And what he saw wasn't just potential, it was brilliance. Clara stood silently, waiting for her fate. The room was filled only with the soft hum of the computer. Ethan's anger hadn't disappeared, but it had been replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: surprise. That night, in the quiet of his study, Ethan Ward realized that his carefully controlled world had just been shaken by the last person he would have ever expected his maid. Ethan's voice echoed in the room, sharp and cold. Clara stood frozen, her back pressed against the wall as if she were trying to disappear into it. She clutched the hem of her apron nervously, her fingers twisting the fabric until it looked as if it might tear. Her eyes darted between the floor and his face, unable to hold his gaze for long. He had caught employees lying before, caught business partners trying to manipulate deals, caught rivals stealing ideas. But this was different. This wasn't happening in the boardroom, it was happening in his private sanctuary, the one place he thought no one would dare to intrude. And here stood Clara, the quiet maid, looking like a frightened bird with wings too weak to fly. "What exactly do you think you're doing with my computer?" Ethan's tone was heavy, every word cutting through the silence like a blade. I wasn't," Clara's voice cracked, and she quickly swallowed before trying again. "I wasn't trying to harm anything, sir. Please believe me. Her words stumbled, broken by fear, as if she couldn't find the right way to explain herself. "Only what?" Ethan demanded, stepping closer. His shoes clicked against the polished floor, the sound making Clara flinch. "Do you understand what you've done? This isn't some toy you can play with. Do you know how many millions of dollars of information sit inside this system? Do you have any idea what kind of damage you could cause? Clara's head dropped lower. Her breathing grew faster, uneven, like someone running uphill with no air to spare. She whispered, I know I was wrong. I shouldn't have touched it. I'm sorry. Ethan expected those words. He had heard apologies from dozens of people before, some genuine, some not. But something about Clara's trembling frame, her pale face, and her unsteady voice struck him in a different way. She looked too sincere, too raw, to be lying. Still, sincerity didn't erase the fact that she had crossed into forbidden territory. Sorry doesn't change the fact that you were sitting here, in my chair, using my computer as if it belonged to you, he said firmly. His hand moved to the mouse, ready to shut everything down and erase whatever she had done. But then his eyes caught the screen again. He leaned closer, his brows knitting together. Lines of code filled the screen from top to bottom. At first, he thought it must have been something from his own files, something she had accidentally opened. But no, this wasn't part of any project he recognized. It was different. Cleaner. More creative. Every command seemed carefully chosen, each function neatly placed. He scrolled through quickly, scanning piece after piece, and the deeper he went, the more unsettled he became. This wasn't random typing. This wasn't guesswork. Whoever had written this knew exactly what they were doing. Ethan straightened, his anger momentarily replaced with something else, curiosity mixed with disbelief. He turned his sharp eyes back to Clara. Did you write this? Clara froze. For a moment, she didn't answer, as if she couldn't believe he had asked the question. Then, in a timid voice, she said, yes. Ethan blinked. The single word hung in the air, heavier than all her apologies. He almost didn't trust his ears. You're telling me, this code, you wrote it? Her voice shook, but there was a spark of truth in it that couldn't be ignored. I used to study computer science, she admitted quietly, her hands still wringing the fabric of her apron. Before I had to leave school. I didn't finish, but I never stopped practicing. I write programs sometimes, just to keep my skills alive. Ethan let the information sink in. His sharp mind, trained to analyze situations quickly, began piecing the puzzle together. Clara wasn't just playing on his computer. She was working, creating, building something that looked more advanced than what many of his own junior developers could produce. He tapped the desk lightly, his eyes never leaving her face. Why my computer? He asked, his tone calmer now but still edged with authority. Clara swallowed hard. Because, my laptop doesn't work anymore. It broke months ago, and I couldn't afford to repair it. I thought, maybe, if I finished this project and showed it somewhere, I could, she trailed off, biting her lip. Her voice grew so soft that Ethan had to strain to hear the rest. I thought maybe I could change my life. Her honesty unsettled him more than her actions. Ethan was used to people chasing after wealth, trying to use him for success, trying to impress him with polished words. But Clara's confession was different. It wasn't polished. It wasn't rehearsed. It was desperate, unguarded, and painfully real. Still, the fact remained, she had broken his trust. He folded his arms, staring at her for a long moment. You know what this looks like, don't you? She nodded quickly, tears glistening at the edge of her eyes. Yes. I know. I wasn't supposed to touch it. You can fire me if you want. I won't argue. I'll leave right now. Her words tumbled out fast, as if she were already preparing herself for the door closing behind her forever. Ethan studied her trembling figure. Something inside him shifted. He wanted to say the words "you're fired." He wanted to keep his rules intact, his boundaries clear. That was how he had always lived, and it had brought him nothing but success. But another part of him hesitated. He thought about the code he had seen. He thought about the precision of her work, the elegance of it. He thought about the possibility that this frightened maid might actually have more talent than half the employees he paid six-figure salaries to. He leaned back slightly, his expression unreadable. "You solved a problem here," he said, pointing to one section of the code. "Why did you design it this way?" Clara blinked, caught off guard by the question. "Because it runs faster," she said slowly, her mind shifting away from fear as she explained. "Most people would add extra lines, but that makes the process heavier. This way, it does the same job in fewer steps. It's cleaner." Ethan listened carefully, his eyes narrowing, not in anger but in concentration. She wasn't guessing. She wasn't reciting something she had read. She understood what she was talking about. And for the first time since walking into the room, Ethan felt something he hadn't expected: admiration. Clara, however, didn't notice the change in his expression. She was still trembling, still certain that any second he would dismiss her. Her heart raced painfully in her chest, her thoughts filled with panic. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating. She finally whispered, "I'll leave now." But Ethan didn't stop her because of anger, he stopped her because of something else entirely. "Sit down," he said suddenly, his voice firm but no longer harsh. Clara froze in place, confused. "Sir." "Sit," he repeated, pointing to the chair she had just abandoned. "I want to see more." Her eyes widened, a mixture of fear and shock flashing across her face. She had expected punishment, not this. She hesitated, unsure whether it was a trap. But when she saw that his expression was serious, almost curious, she slowly stepped forward and sat again. Ethan leaned over the desk, watching closely as she placed her fingers back on the keyboard. The atmosphere in the room had changed. A moment ago, it had been filled with anger and fear. Now it was filled with something else, an electric tension, as if both of them realized they had stepped into uncharted territory. Ethan folded his arms, his sharp eyes fixed on the screen. Clara adjusted herself nervously, her hands trembling slightly as they hovered over the keys. She didn't know what was about to happen. She only knew one thing: her secret was out, and there was no turning back. And for the first time in years, Ethan Ward, the unshakable CEO, felt his carefully built world tilt in a direction he had never imagined. Clara's fingers rested on the keyboard, trembling as if the keys themselves were too heavy to touch. Her eyes flickered between the glowing screen and Ethan's piercing stare. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, each beat louder than the last. The silence in the room was almost unbearable. Ethan stood over her, his arms folded tightly against his chest. His anger had softened, but his expression was still sharp, still demanding answers. He was not a man who liked mysteries in his life, and right now, Clara was the biggest mystery standing in front of him. Finally, Clara broke the silence. Her voice was soft, unsteady, but honest. "I didn't mean to upset you, sir. I couldn't help myself. I miss this too much." Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Miss what?" She swallowed hard, gathering the courage to explain. "Coding. Building things with words and numbers on a screen. It used to be my life." Her words surprised him. Ethan pulled out the chair across from her desk and sat down slowly, his sharp gaze never leaving her face. He wasn't used to giving anyone his time like this, let alone a maid who had broken his trust. But there was something about her trembling honesty that made him curious. "Explain," he said simply. Clara's hands tightened in her lap. She looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "I was studying computer science. It was my dream to become a programmer. I loved solving problems, creating systems, making things better. When I was in school, I worked harder than anyone. I stayed up nights, learning more than what the teachers gave us. I wanted to prove myself." Her lips curved into a faint smile at the memory, though it quickly faded. "But then, life got in the way. My father lost his job. My younger brother needed medical care. We had no money. I tried to balance work and school, but it became impossible. I had to make a choice. I left school. Ethan listened quietly, his expression unreadable. Clara's voice carried no self-pity, only quiet acceptance of a reality she had been forced into. I started working as a maid, she continued softly. It was the only job I could find that paid enough to help my family right away. I thought it would just be temporary, but months turned into years. My dream of being a programmer began to feel like something I had imagined, not something I could ever reach again. Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she quickly blinked them away. She didn't want to cry in front of him. She didn't want him to see her as weak. Still, I couldn't let it go completely. Whenever I found an old computer, or borrowed a friend's laptop, I practiced. I tried to keep my skills alive. Even if nobody saw it, even if it meant nothing, I couldn't stop. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his sharp mind working quickly. He had heard many stories in his life, stories of struggle, stories of ambition. But there was something raw about Clara's words. They weren't polished like the speeches he heard from people trying to impress him. They were real. He turned his eyes back to the screen, scrolling through the code she had written. Each line spoke of discipline, creativity, and intelligence. He thought about his own employees, the programmers who earned high salaries, who had access to the best resources, and yet, often delivered work far less efficient than this. You wrote all of this, he said quietly, almost to himself. Clara nodded. Yes. It's a program I've been working on. I didn't mean to save it here. I just wanted to try finishing it with a machine that could handle it. My old laptop kept crashing, and I couldn't afford repairs. I thought, maybe if I completed it, I could find a way to use it to get a better job. Her voice broke slightly at the end. She lowered her head, ashamed. I know it was wrong to use your computer. I shouldn't have done it. I was desperate, and I thought nobody would ever find out. For the first time, Ethan didn't feel the urge to scold her. Instead, he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar: respect. He stared at her, studying her nervous frame. She didn't look like a thief or a liar. She looked like someone who had been carrying a heavy burden for far too long, yet still refused to let go of her dream. He remembered the first day she had started working in his home. She had kept her eyes lowered, her words short and polite. He had assumed she was just another ordinary worker. But now he realized how wrong he had been. There was an entire world hidden behind those lowered eyes, a world he had never bothered to notice. Ethan's voice softened, though it still carried authority. Clara, do you know how advanced this work is? She hesitated, unsure if it was a trap. I think it's good. I tested parts of it. But I never had anyone professional to review it. It's more than good, Ethan said firmly, surprising even himself. It's the kind of work that takes years of discipline. Some of my employees wouldn't be able to produce this, even with training. Clara's eyes widened in shock. For a moment, she forgot her fear, and her lips parted slightly as if she couldn't believe what she had just heard. You really think so? Ethan nodded slowly. I don't say things I don't mean. A silence followed, but it wasn't the same tense silence from before. It was softer, filled with something unspoken. Clara's hands finally stilled in her lap, though her shoulders were still tight. She didn't know what this meant for her. Would he forgive her? Would he punish her? She couldn't tell. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. You could have been more than this, Clara. More than a maid. You still could be. Her breath caught. She looked at him, her eyes shining with disbelief. I don't know. That life feels too far away now. People like me don't get second chances. Ethan's sharp eyes narrowed slightly. He had spent his entire career proving people wrong, turning failures into opportunities, transforming small ideas into massive empires. To him, the words "too far away" had never existed. And now, he couldn't help but see the same spark of possibility in Clara that he had once seen in himself years ago. "You're wrong," he said simply. Clara's chest tightened. She didn't know why, but those two words, spoken in his steady voice, made something inside her stir, something she thought she had buried forever. Hope. Still, she lowered her gaze again. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change what I did tonight. I broke your trust. I used your computer without permission. You should fire me." Ethan studied her face carefully. Most people in her position would be begging to keep their job. But Clara wasn't begging. She was accepting punishment, even suggesting it, because she knew she had crossed a line. That honesty only confirmed to him that she was different from anyone else he had met. He didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned back to the screen, scrolling once more through her work. The clean lines of code glowed in the dim light of the study, silently proving her skill. Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in years, a quiet thrill of discovery. Clara stood silently, waiting for his decision. She braced herself for the worst, her heart heavy but prepared. Yet deep inside, a tiny spark refused to die. A tiny part of her wondered if maybe, just maybe, this night could change everything. And as Ethan closed the window of her unfinished program and looked back at her, he knew one thing for certain: the maid he had almost dismissed as ordinary was anything but ordinary. The study was quiet, but not in the same way it had been before. The heavy silence of fear had shifted into something different, a silence filled with questions, possibilities, and an unspoken tension neither Ethan nor Clara fully understood. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on her, sharp and thoughtful, while Clara sat stiffly in the chair, her hands resting nervously on her lap. Ethan leaned back slowly, his fingers drumming lightly against the desk. "You say you studied computer science," he said, his voice steady, almost calm now. "And this code, what I've seen, it's not ordinary. But I need to know something." Clara lifted her eyes cautiously. "What is that, sir?" "I need to know if it's real skill, or just luck," Ethan replied. "Anyone can copy, anyone can guess. But solving real problems, that's different." Clara's chest tightened. Her voice came out low. "You want me to prove it?" "Yes," Ethan said simply, his tone leaving no room for doubt. For a moment, Clara's mind raced. Fear gripped her. What if she failed? What if this was the test that would prove she wasn't good enough? If she failed in front of him, there would be no second chance. She would not only lose her job, but also destroy the last fragile hope she had been holding onto. Her fingers twisted together nervously. I'm not sure." Ethan raised a hand, stopping her. "If you're telling me the truth, then show me. If you're lying, I'll know in 5 minutes." His words were firm, but not cruel. There was challenge in them, and perhaps even a spark of something else: expectation. Clara swallowed hard, then nodded slowly. "All right." Ethan turned to his computer, opening a new file. "This is a problem my company's developers are working on right now," he said, typing quickly. "It's slowing down part of our system. They've come up with solutions, but none are efficient enough. Let's see what you do with it." The screen filled with data and code, complicated and messy. Clara leaned forward, her eyes scanning the problem. For a few seconds, her fear tried to take over again, whispering that she wasn't ready, that she couldn't possibly match the kind of people who worked for someone like him. But then something shifted inside her. The familiar rhythm of logic began to take over. Her eyes focused. Her breathing steadied. And her hands moved toward the keyboard. Ethan watched carefully. He expected hesitation, confusion, maybe even panic. But what he saw surprised him. The moment Clara's fingers touched the keys, her fear seemed to melt away. Her movements grew steady, confident. She didn't waste time staring helplessly at the screen. She studied the lines, then began to work, her thoughts flowing straight into code. Minutes passed. Clara typed quickly, pausing only to review her steps. Ethan leaned forward, his sharp eyes narrowing as he followed her process. She wasn't just fixing the problem, she was rethinking it, rewriting it in a way that none of his employees had suggested. At one point, Ethan interrupted softly, "Why are you doing it that way?" Clara didn't stop typing. "Because the current system is carrying too much weight. Most people try to patch it, but that only makes it heavier. I'm restructuring it so it runs leaner. It should cut the load time in half." Ethan said nothing, but his eyes lingered on her face. There was no hesitation in her explanation, no uncertainty. She spoke like someone who belonged in this world, someone who had lived in code long enough to understand its language. After another 10 minutes, Clara stopped. She leaned back slightly, her hands trembling again now that the rush of focus was fading. She glanced nervously at Ethan. I think it's done. You can test it." Ethan didn't waste time. He ran the program she had written, his eyes fixed on the screen as the system responded. Seconds later, the results came in. The load time had been cut almost exactly in half, just as she had predicted. Not only that, the process ran smoother, cleaner, without the small glitches that had troubled the earlier versions. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt his composure slip. His eyebrows lifted slightly, his lips parting as he stared at the numbers. He almost couldn't believe it. Clara sat frozen, waiting for his reaction. Her heart pounded painfully, each second of silence stretching longer and longer. She wondered if she had done something wrong, if maybe the results weren't what he wanted. Finally, Ethan spoke, his voice quiet but filled with a weight she didn't expect. "You solved it." Clara blinked, unsure if she had heard correctly. I did." He turned his eyes to her, sharp but no longer cold. "Yes. You did. And you didn't just solve it, you solved it better than my team." Clara's lips parted in shock. She couldn't find the words to respond. For so long, she had dreamed of being seen, of proving herself, but she had never imagined hearing those words from someone like him. Ethan leaned back in his chair, studying her carefully. He had hired some of the brightest graduates from the best schools. He paid them high salaries, gave them the best resources. Yet here was Clara, a maid with no degree, sitting in his study and outsmarting all of them in under half an hour. It was almost unbelievable. Almost. But the proof was on the screen. "You have talent," Ethan said firmly, his voice steady again. "Real talent. And you've been hiding it behind a mop and apron." Clara lowered her head, her cheeks burning. "It doesn't matter. I can't use it. Nobody will take me seriously. I don't have the right background. I don't have money. I don't even have a computer of my own anymore." Ethan's eyes narrowed. He heard the hopelessness in her voice, the weight of years of struggle pressing down on her. But he also heard something else, the spark of someone who had refused to give up completely, no matter how impossible it seemed. He leaned forward slightly, his tone sharper. "Do you think talent asks for permission? Do you think skill cares about money or background? What you just did, Clara, people get paid a fortune for that. And you did it in minutes." Clara's eyes filled with tears, though she quickly tried to blink them away. She couldn't remember the last time someone had spoken to her like that, not with pity, but with belief. Still, doubt clung to her. "Even if that's true, it doesn't change who I am. I'm just your maid." Ethan's jaw tightened. "You were hired as my maid. That doesn't mean that's all you are." The room fell silent again, but this time, the silence was charged with something new. Clara sat trembling, overwhelmed, while Ethan's sharp mind raced. He had stumbled onto something he hadn't expected, something valuable, something rare. For years, he had built his empire on finding potential others overlooked, on seeing what others couldn't. And now, sitting across from him, was perhaps the most surprising discovery of all. Clara didn't know it yet, but in that moment, Ethan had already made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this talent slip away. He leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable but his decision clear in his heart. "You've just proven something, Clara," he said quietly. "And I don't ignore proof." Clara swallowed hard, her chest tight with a mixture of fear, confusion, and the faintest flicker of hope. She didn't know what he meant, not yet. But she could feel it, the world around her was shifting, and nothing would ever be the same again. Clara sat in the chair, her hands resting nervously on her lap, the glow of the computer screen reflecting on her pale face. She had just proven herself in a way she had never imagined possible. The program she wrote had not only worked, it had impressed Ethan Ward, a man who rarely gave compliments and never wasted words. Yet even now, she could hardly believe it. Ethan's eyes stayed fixed on her, sharp and thoughtful, as if he were looking past her trembling frame and into the future she could not yet see. His silence was heavy, filled with meaning. Clara shifted uncomfortably, afraid to break it. Finally, Ethan spoke. His voice was calm, steady, but carried a weight that made her sit up straighter. "Clara, what you did tonight, it's not something I can ignore. People like you don't come along often." Clara lowered her head quickly, shaking it. "Please, sir, don't say that. I'm just a maid. I clean your home. That's all." "No," Ethan said firmly, leaning forward. "That's what you do. But that's not who you are." Clara froze. The difference in his words struck her deeply. She had spent so many years defining herself by her work, by the apron she wore, by the endless hours of cleaning floors and dusting shelves. She had forgotten that once, not long ago, she had been something more, a student with dreams, a young woman filled with ambition. Ethan's tone softened slightly, though it still carried his usual authority. "You have a gift. I've seen hundreds of people claim to be talented, but very few truly are. What you showed me tonight, that's the kind of skill that changes lives." Clara's throat tightened. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. She quickly wiped it away, ashamed. "Even if that's true, nobody would believe me. Nobody would give me a chance. Not without a degree, not without connections. I don't belong in your world." Ethan studied her for a long moment. Then he said something that made her heart stop. "Then I'll give you a chance." Clara blinked rapidly, certain she had misheard. "What?" "I'm offering you a position at my company," Ethan said clearly. "Not as a maid. As a trainee, an entry-level programmer. You'll start small, learn, grow. If you work hard, you'll climb. I'll make sure of it." Her eyes widened. The words didn't feel real. She shook her head in disbelief. "Sir, you can't be serious." "Me? Work in your company?" "I don't even. I'm always serious," Ethan interrupted, his voice firm. "Do you think I waste time on things that don't matter? I saw what you did. I don't care about where you came from, or what job title you had yesterday. I care about what you can do. And you can do more than you realize." Clara's lips trembled. A flood of emotions rushed through her: hope, fear, excitement, doubt. For years, she had carried the weight of lost dreams, convincing herself that her time had passed. And now, in the most unexpected moment, the door she thought was locked forever was being opened again. But with that hope came fear. What if she failed? What if she proved him wrong? Her voice shook. "What if I disappoint you? What if I can't keep up?" Ethan's eyes didn't waver. "Then you'll learn. Failure doesn't scare me. Wasted potential does. And you, Clara, you have too much potential to waste." His words sank deep into her, warming the cold corners of her heart that had been dark for so long. For the first time in years, she felt something stir inside her, something she had buried under layers of duty and survival. She felt alive. Still, she hesitated. I don't know if I can just leave this job. My family depends on me. This is the only steady income I have. Ethan nodded slowly, understanding. Then don't leave it yet. Start with me part-time. Train at the company while still working here until you're ready to make the full change. I'll make the arrangement. I'm not offering charity, Clara. I'm offering an opportunity. What you do with it, that's up to you. Clara's chest rose and fell quickly. She stared at him, trying to read his expression, searching for any hint of insincerity. But there was none. His eyes were steady, his tone certain. He meant every word. Slowly, almost in disbelief, she whispered, "You really believe I can do this?" "Yes," Ethan said without hesitation. "And one day, you will believe it too." The room fell quiet again, but this time, the silence was not heavy with fear. It was filled with possibility, like the first breath of dawn after a long night. Clara wiped her eyes, her lips curving into the faintest smile. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like a dark, endless road. It looked like a beginning. Ethan stood, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the desk. He closed the computer, the hum of the machine fading into silence. "It's late," he said calmly. "We'll discuss details tomorrow. For now, go home. Rest. Think about what I've said." Clara stood slowly, her legs unsteady. She nodded, her voice soft but filled with gratitude. "Thank you, sir. I don't know how to thank you enough." "Don't thank me," Ethan said, turning toward the window, where the city lights glimmered against the dark sky. "Just don't waste this chance." Clara nodded again, clutching her apron tightly as she walked toward the door. Every step felt unreal, as if she were walking in a dream she was afraid to wake from. Before she left the room, she glanced back once more. Ethan was still standing at the window, his expression unreadable, his sharp mind already miles ahead, planning. When she stepped into the quiet hallway, Clara pressed a hand against her chest. Her heart was racing, but not from fear this time. From hope. She whispered to herself, barely audible, "Maybe this is it. Maybe this is my second chance." That night, as she walked home through the cool streets, Clara felt lighter than she had in years. She thought of her brother, her family, of the sacrifices she had made. For the first time, she imagined telling them good news, real good news. And in his study, Ethan Ward stood alone, staring out at the city he had conquered. He thought about the maid he had caught sitting at his computer, the girl who had dared to break his rules. He thought about the lines of code that had stopped him cold, that had reminded him that genius doesn't always come from where you expect. For years, Ethan had built his empire on vision, on seeing potential where others saw nothing. And tonight, he had discovered a talent hidden in the shadows of his own home. He smiled faintly, a rare expression that few had ever seen. Sometimes, he murmured to himself, brilliance comes from the most unexpected places. And with that thought, he turned off the lights in his study. Tomorrow would be the start of something new, not just for Clara, but for him as well. Because sometimes, a single night, a single discovery, can change everything.